In September of the year 1811, a little boy arrived at the door of Aswarby Hall in the middle of Lincolnshire. He rang the bell and looked around him at the tall, square, 18th century house. An evening light fell on the building, making the windows shine like fires. In front of the hall, there was a park full of trees and a church with a clock. It all seemed very pleasant to the boy as he waited for someone to open the door. The boy's parents were dead, and his elderly cousin, Mr. Abney, had invited him to come and live at Aswarby. People who knew Mr. Abney were surprised at his offer because they thought he was a man who loved books more than people and who preferred to live alone. Mr. Abney opened the door and seemed very happy to see his young cousin, Stephen Elliott. He immediately started to ask questions. "How old are you, my boy? How are you? And how old are you? I hope you are not too tired to eat your supper." "No, thank you, sir," said Stephen. "I am quite well." "Good," said Mr. Abney. "And how old are you, my boy?" It seemed strange that he asked the question twice in the first 2 minutes of their conversation. "I'm 12 years old next birthday," said Stephen. "And when is your birthday, my dear boy?" 11th of September. That's good. That's very good. I like to write these things down in my book. Are you sure you will be 12? "Yes, sir, quite sure." "Well, take him to Mrs. Bunch's room, Parks," Mr. Abney said to his servant, "and let him have his supper." Mrs. Bunch was the friendliest person at Aswarby. Stephen felt comfortable with her, and they became good friends in a quarter of an hour. She was 55 years old and knew everything about the house and its neighborhood. She was quite willing to share this information with Stephen, and there were certainly many things about Aswarby Hall and its gardens that the boy wanted to ask her. One November evening, Stephen was sitting by the fire in Mrs. Bunch's room, thinking about his new home. "Is Mr. Abney a good man?" he suddenly asked. "Good? My child," said Mrs. Bunch. "He's the kindest man I've ever known. Haven't I told you about the little boy he brought here from the street 7 years ago, and the little girl 2 years after I started working here?" "No, please tell me about them, Mrs. Bunch," said Stephen. "Well," she began, "I don't remember much about the little girl. Mr. Abney brought her back from his walk one day and told Mrs. Ellis to take care of her. The poor child had no family. She lived with us for about 3 weeks, and then one morning she got up while everyone was still asleep and left the house. I've never seen her again. Mr. Abney looked everywhere, but she never came back. She was a very silent child, but she helped me a lot, and I loved her very much." "And what about the little boy?" asked Stephen. "Ah, that poor boy," said Mrs. Bunch. "He came here one winter day playing his music, and Mr. Abney asked him lots of questions, such as, 'Where do you come from? How old are you? Where are your family?' He was very kind to the boy, but the same thing happened. He just disappeared. That night, Stephen had a strange dream. Near his bedroom at the top of the house, there was an old bathroom that nobody used. The top of the door was made of glass, and it was possible to look in and see. In his dream, Stephen looked through the glass and saw a body in the bath. A very thin, dusty body with a sad smile and hands pressed over the heart. As Stephen looked, a terrible cry came from the lips, and the arms began to move. Stephen was extremely frightened and woke up suddenly. He found that he really was standing on the cold floor near the bathroom. Bravely, he looked through the glass again to see if the body was really there. It was not. He went back to bed. When they heard about Stephen's experience, Mrs. Bunch and Mr. Abney were very interested. Mrs. Bunch put a new curtain over the glass door of the bathroom, and Mr. Abney said he would write about Stephen's dream in his book. It was nearly spring when 2 more strange things happened. The first was that Stephen had another very uneasy night. The next day, he saw Mrs. Bunch mending his nightshirt. She seemed rather angry with him and asked, "How did you manage to tear your nightshirt so badly? It'll take me a long time to mend it." Stephen looked and saw that there were some cuts in the shirt, a few inches long. "I don't remember how it happened," he said. "I don't remember anything, but they're just the same as the scratches on the outside of my bedroom door." Mrs. Bunch looked at him, her mouth open, and then ran upstairs to see. "Well," she said when she returned, It's very strange. I wonder how those scratches appeared. They're too high for a dog, a cat, or a rat to make. Don't say anything to Mr. Abney, but remember to lock your door when you go to bed tonight." "Oh, I always do," replied Stephen. The next evening, the second strange thing happened. Mr. Parks, the servant, visited Stephen and Mrs. Bunch in Mrs. Bunch's room. He did not often come to see them there. When he came in, he didn't at first notice that Stephen was there. He seemed very nervous and uneasy. "Mr. Abney will have to get his own wine if he wants a drink in the evenings," he said. "If I can't go down and get it in the daytime, I won't go at all. There's something very strange down there under the house, you know. Maybe it's the wind or maybe it's rats, but I don't think so, and I don't like it." "Don't talk like that," answered Mrs. Bunch. "You'll frighten young Stephen." Mr. Parks suddenly noticed Stephen for the first time and quickly said, with a nervous laugh, "Oh, I was only joking, you know." But Stephen knew that it wasn't a joke, and he was worried. He asked a lot of questions, but Mr. Parks refused to tell him any more about the noises under the house. It was now March 24th, 1812, a strange and windy day. Stephen stood in the garden and felt as if it was full of ghosts, people he couldn't see, flying in the wind and trying to contact the living in the real world. After lunch, Mr. Abney said, "Stephen, my boy, will you come to my library late tonight at 11 o'clock? I will be busy until then, but I want to show you something about your future life. Don't tell Mrs. Bunch or anyone else in the house. Just go to your room at the usual time." Stephen was excited. He could stay up until 11 o'clock. On his way upstairs that evening, he looked in at the library door and saw a silver cup filled with red wine and an old piece of paper with words on it. Around 10 o'clock, Stephen was standing at the open window of his bedroom, looking out over the nighttime countryside. The wind had calmed, and there was a full moon. Suddenly, he heard strange cries. Perhaps someone lost in the night, he thought, or water birds down by the lake in the park. The noises grew louder and closer to the house, then abruptly stopped. Just as Stephen was about to close his window and continue reading, he saw two children standing outside under the dark trees, a boy and a girl. They stood together, looking up at his window. The girl reminded him of the girl from his dream about the bath, and the sight of the boy filled him with fear. The girl smiled, holding her hands over her heart, while the boy, with untidy black hair and old clothes, stretched his hands out helplessly. His fingernails were long and dirty. As the boy stood there with his arms outstretched, Stephen noticed something that chilled him to the bone. A large black hole on the left side of the boy's chest. The children emitted terrible, sad cries and then vanished. Despite his fear, Stephen decided to go to Mr. Abney's library. It was nearly 11 o'clock. He hurried through the dark, quiet house, with all the servants in bed. When he reached the library, he found the door wouldn't open. It wasn't locked and the key was on the outside, but when he knocked, there was no answer. He listened intently and heard Mr. Abney speaking, or crying out. Could he, too, see the strange children? Then, suddenly, silence fell, and the library door swung open on its own. Inside, Mr. Abney sat in his chair, head thrown back, eyes wide with fear and pain. There was a large hole on the left side of his chest, revealing his heart, yet there was no blood on his hands. A clean, long knife lay on the table. The window was open, and the wind whipped the curtains in a dreadful dance. An old book lay open on the table, and Stephen read the horrifying truth. Thousands of years ago, people discovered the power to control the world, to fly, to disappear, or to become someone or something else, all through magic. But to wield this magic, it is necessary first to take the hearts of 3 young people under 21 years of age. I have spent almost 20 years carefully selecting 3 young people whom I could kill without anyone noticing. The first was Phoebe Stanley on March 24th, 1791. The second was an Italian boy, Giovanni Paoli, on March 23rd, 1805. And tonight, on March 24th, 1812, the final child to die for me will be my cousin, Stephen Elliott. No one will ever find the bodies of these children. I have hidden the first 2 in my wine cellar under the floor, and I will do the same with the 3rd child tonight. The ghosts of these children may return, crying horribly. They may try to take the heart of the man who killed them, but this will not happen to me. I am sure. Stephen finished reading and silently left the room, closing the door behind him. For many years, people speculated about Mr. Abney's death. It must have been a wild cat that came in through the open window and killed the poor man, they said. But Stephen knew the truth.